For you, ecological justice and people's development in India. Since already 10 minutes are over, let me quickly get down to business. Here is the outline of my framework of my lecture. The morning's lecture. I'll give a brief introduction and spend a few minutes talking about the conceptual foundations of these two terms that are there in our topic. One is ecological justice. How am I looking at ecological justice? How do we need to look at ecological justice? A couple of points about this. Also, a couple of points about this term called people's development. That is by way of conceptual foundations. I'll briefly take you into the historical context because when we're looking at ecological justice, we cannot begin from independence onward. We'll have to go back to the British period. And many of the laws that we still seem to think important can be traced back to the British origins. So a brief look at the historical context is important. That's the third aspect in my outline. In the fourth aspect, and this is the most important part of my framework, I'll be looking at 5 or 6 environmental movements in the country. And I'm looking at these movements as expressions of ecological justice. I'll be spending quite some time looking at these movements, telling you about what these movements basically were all about initially, and then also going into what are the learnings, what are the lessons that we need to remember as far as these environmental movements are concerned. Then I look at the legal and constitutional framework of ecological justice and people's development in India. The next aspect, I'll be identifying a few key themes in people's development. I won't go into too many details, but I think there are 3 or 4 important themes that we need to look at. Professor Krishna Umbal wanted me to bring out in the course of my presentation Vandana Shiva's contributions. Both Professor Krishna Umbal and I are in a way fans of Professor Vandana Shiva. We read her writings and we follow her writings very carefully. Whenever she's in town, we don't miss a chance to meet her and talk to her. Her contribution to the concept of ecological justice is tremendous in this country. There's one person who has made a huge contribution to ecological justice in India. It's Vandana Shiva. So one section of my presentation will look at Vandana Shiva's contributions and how she looks at ecological justice. Another important part of my framework is titled Challenges and Contradiction. This is the 8th part of my framework because when you're looking at ecological justice and people's development and juxtapose ecological justice, people's development against the dominant or the mainstream model of development, there are quite a few challenges. There are quite a few contradictions that we need to be aware of. How do we come out of this scenario? How do we address these challenges? How do we look at these contradictions? My next section, titled Way Forward, provides some indication as to what we need to do to proceed further. And I'll conclude with a few 2 to 3. I'll make 2 to 3 concluding observations at the end. So this is my outline for you to get an idea as to how I'm going to deal with this topic, ecological justice and people's development in India. By way of introduction, there are 2 points I would like to place before you. When we use the term ecological justice, very broadly, we are referring to the fair treatment of all living beings and the environment in development processes. Okay, so please note that I am referring to all living beings, not just the human species. Ecological justice refers to the fair treatment of all species living on the planet and the interrelationship of all these species with the environment while we are engaged in developmental or development processes. And this is where it's important that when we're looking at ecological justice, we are able to integrate environmental sustainability with social equity. That's my first point by way of introduction. The second point, when we look at now what I said in the first point is applicable across the world, but when we focus our attention on India, the discourse on ecological justice we find has become central to debates on several themes. In a debate on sustainable development, ecological justice becomes important. In the discourse on environmental movements, ecological justice is important. In a discussion on indigenous rights or the rights of indigenous peoples in India, ecological justice becomes important. And at a more broader level, at a macro level, if you're looking at alternative development models, here also the term ecological justice becomes very important. So these are 2 points I'm making by way of introduction. Whom are we talking about when we refer to the term or when we use the term ecological justice? And then in what context or contexts do we need to bring in and understand the term ecological justice? So let me expand on this a little more in the second part of my framework, conceptual foundations. Ecological justice, I'm making this very clear, goes beyond environmentalism. There are many other terms that have entered our dictionary. We are all students of political science, and the term ecological justice has entered political science also in a fairly big way. And in political science, when we're dealing with sustainable development, when we're dealing with alternative development models and so on, we may also bring in terms like environmentalism, ecologism, and so on. So when we speak of ecological justice, are we only speaking about environmentalism, or are we speaking about environmentalism, or are we going beyond that? And I'm saying here that when we use the term ecological justice, when I use the term ecological justice, I'm stating that we need to go beyond our understanding of the term called environmentalism. Because environmentalism may refer to protection of nature. Many people think that environmentalism is protection of nature. But when we say ecological justice, we are bringing in justice for marginalized humans as well as the other species on this planet. Okay? And linked, point number 2, linked to environmental justice, the term that we're using here, there's a broader understanding when we use the term environmental justice. The broader understanding, the distinction, I'm making the distinction here between environmental justice and ecological justice. So ecological justice is linked to environmental justice, but it is broader. And how is it broader than environmental justice? It's broader because it not only includes interspecies, meaning that all species on the planet, it also brings in the term intergenerational equity, meaning that from one generation to the other, it's important that the environment is preserved, environment is protected, and therefore ecological justice goes beyond environmental justice. That's my second point. The third point, I'm saying this, ecological justice promotes equitable access to resources, equitable access to environmental benefits. It also believes in what is called equitable burden sharing of environmental harms. By environmental harms, I'm referring to environmental pollution, various forms of environmental pollution. If we accept the logic that when we are doing development, there are bound to be environmental consequences, environmental pollution, then how do we deal with environmental pollution, be it air, be it water, be it in any other place? How do we deal with environmental pollution? Then there's this term in environmental science called equitable burden sharing. So 3 points by way of conceptual foundation and understanding of ecological justice, and I've just made these 3 points clear. The other term in our topic is called people's development. Here also 3 quick points to tell you how I'm looking at people's development. When we look at people's development, I'm referring to a rights-based approach to development. I'm looking at a bottom-up approach to development. I'm sure you're aware of the fact that development can be both top-down as well as bottom-up. Most forms of development are top-down in the sense that the government decides, leaders decide what is development, experts decide what is development, and very little say given to people about how they would look at development. That is top-down, that is a centralized kind of development. But when we say, or when we use the term people's development, we are not talking about top-down or centralized or imposed development. We're looking at development which is quite the opposite. We're looking at a rights-based, bottom-up approach to development. Point number one. Point number two, when we use the term people's development, we are recognizing a lot of communities at the grassroots level. We're recognizing the role of people and accepting all these communities as key stakeholders in the development process. And when I mention communities, whom am I talking about? I have given a few examples here. When we need to recognize communities in our understanding of people's development, we could be talking about indigenous peoples, we could be talking about scheduled tribes, we could be speaking about Dalits, scheduled castes, we could be speaking about women, we could be speaking about peasants and farmers. These are, I think, the key stakeholders in the development process in our country. And therefore, when we use the term people's development, we've got to ask the question, how is this kind of development affecting our scheduled tribes, our scheduled castes, our women, our peasants, and so on? Are they treated? Are they being treated as key stakeholders, or are they being treated as mere beneficiaries of the development process? That's point number two I want you to understand when we're looking at people's development. Point number three, people's development focuses on at least three important objectives. Number one, empowerment. If people's development is truly people's development, then it ought to focus on one, empowerment. If people's development is truly people's development, it must also focus on sustainability. And you're familiar with the term sustainable development. And if people's development is truly people's development, people must enjoy autonomy over natural resources. So this is a brief explanation of the term people's development that we are using which is there in my topic and which I'll be referring to in the course of my presentation. This is the second part of my framework. How do we understand the concepts of ecological justice and people's development? With that, let me get into the third aspect in my outline, which deals with the colonial legacy. How far back in time do we have to go to be able to understand why it's important for us to look at ecological justice and people's development? If you look at the extractive exploitation of forests, of rivers, of minerals, of natural resources, all of this technically began under British dispensation, under colonial rule. Some parts of our country may have come under other colonial rulers, but by and large, the British ruled over the length and breadth of the country, a large part of the length and breadth of the country. And it was the British imperialist design that there must be exploitation of forests, exploitation of rivers, exploitation of natural resources. So under the British dispensation, we see this extractive exploitation of our natural resources taking place. A byproduct of this extractive exploitation was dispossession of tribal and forest dwelling communities, meaning that when you're doing development in all these areas, when you're exploiting forests, when you're cutting down forests for development, when you're damming rivers for development, when you're extracting natural resources for development, all the people who are living in those areas would need to be automatically dispossessed, in the sense that you have to drive them away from where they are living, because these people are living, their villages are located above uh, these very rich natural resources. And therefore, it's natural, it's quite logical, I suppose, to ask these people to vacate, because the government says, we wish to extract, we wish to exploit, we need to take out those valuable natural resources. So during the British period, there were a series of forest acts that were enacted, and three such forest acts I'm briefly referring you to. I'm not going into these details. In 1865, in 1878, and in 1927, we had forest acts. But if you think that forest acts, given the term forest acts, if you thought that these were acts, these were enactments that tried to protect forests. Well, you would be wrong, because these forest acts actually dealt with how the people living in those forests needed to be taken away, needed to be moved away from their immediate locations and relocated somewhere else. So this is a point I'm making, which you may like to go back to colonial legacy, but that's not very important according to me. If you're looking at ecological justice and people's development in India, I think we need to come down to the present. So my second part in the historical context, I'm looking at post-independence development model. What kind of development model did India go in for after it became independent? And if this point is to be explained in a very short sentence, it would be India believed in state-led industrialization. That was a model of development that India believed in. What was the essence of the state-led industrialization? Well, it prioritized large dams, big dams. It prioritized mining. It prioritized mega infrastructure projects. And two quick examples would be the Bhakra Nangal project and the Hirakud Dam project, which in a way tells us what kind of mega development India was looking for soon after it became independent. So if India believed in mega development, India believed in big dams, India believed in setting up mega infrastructure, what were the consequences of this kind of state-led industrialization? Well, automatically there was massive displacement of indigenous communities. All those communities located in those areas, they needed to be displaced. And displacement also generally accompanies, compensation rehabilitation generally accompanies displacement. And on paper, it was shown that all these displaced indigenous communities were being rehabilitated, were being compensated, and so on. But that was only on paper. If you look at reports that pointed out where exactly did these people, where were they relocated, how were they rehabilitated, what kind of compensation did they get? If you look for details, there are reports which tell us that whatever was given to them was very inadequate. Something may have reached them, but their compensation was very inadequate. Rehabilitation was shown on paper, it was done. But if you went 2 years later, 5 years later, 10 years later, and looked at what kind of rehabilitation was it successfully done, were they happy with the rehabilitation, you will find that very few families remained in those places where they had been rehabilitated. And studies tell us that the places where they were given rehabilitation were places which were actually unfit for human habitation. Okay, so we're coming to ecological costs also. Apart from the displacement without adequate compensation, without adequate rehabilitation that happens thanks to our state-led industrialization development model, there were huge ecological costs in terms of deforestation, in terms of soil erosion, in terms of various kinds of pollution, air, water, land. All of these were viewed as necessary costs of development. The argument you cannot do development without environmental or without ecological costs. You cannot do development without deforestation. You cannot do development without soil erosion. You cannot do development without various kinds of pollution. These are the necessary costs of development. That was the argument that was placed before people who questioned this particular model of development. With that, let me come to environmental, the fourth aspect in my outline. Environmental movements as expressions of ecological justice. I'm beginning with this movement, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the Chipko movement. This was a women-led forest conservation movement, and a few quick points about what kind of a movement this was, where, when, and so on. The Chipko movement is described as a grassroots environmental movement that began in the 1970s, primarily led by rural women in the Himalayas. What does the term chipko mean? Chipko translates to hug or embrace. Why was the term chipko used for this movement? Because protesters would hug trees to prevent them from being cut down. When the woodman comes, when the tree cutters come with axes, with saws, and so on, well, these women would hug the trees and prevent those trees from being cut down. Now, this movement made history. It is considered a landmark example of community-led environmental activism, and the Chipko movement has inspired similar movements around the world. This is about the Chipko movement as one, or perhaps one of the earliest expressions of ecological justice. The second in my list refers to the Narmada Bachao Andolan. This was a movement that began in 1985 to protest the Sardar Sarovar Dam project, SSP, Sardar Sarovar project as it was called, SSP project, SSP on the Narmada River. This is a big river, huge river, which flows through as many as three states, Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh, and Maharashtra, before entering the sea. This Andolan, called the Narmada Bachao Andolan, let us save the Narmada, was led by activists like Medha Patkar and Baba Amte. And this NBA, Narmada Bachao Andolan, raised concerns, several concerns. Some of these we have looked at already. But some of the concerns were A, displacement of people, B, environmental damage, and C, inadequate rehabilitation policies. These were the major concerns that were raised by Medha Patkar and Baba Amte. That is the Narmada Bachao Andolan. Third in my list is the Silent Valley movement. This was a pivotal environmental campaign in Kerala that aimed to protect the Silent Valley. Silent Valley as a pristine, evergreen tropical forest. In which part of Kerala? In the Palghat district of Kerala. And this Silent Valley project was a project which would across this particular river. I'm not sure how you pronounce this name. I won't try to pronounce the name. Those of you from Kerala may be able to pronounce this name better than me. But this was a proposed hydroelectric project across this K river in the Palghat district of Kerala. And the Silent Valley was a pristine, continues to be a pristine evergreen tropical forest. But this river runs through the Silent Valley. And by this hydroelectric project across this river, the Silent Valley would have been destroyed. So we had the Silent Valley movement led by environmentalists, led by scientists, led by local communities. And the leadership was provided by the KSSP. KSSP stands for Kerala Shastra Sahitya Parishad. The KSSP spearheaded the movement to save the Silent Valley and to prevent the hydroelectric project from being set up. Okay, this is one example of a successful movement because the Silent Valley movement succeeded in stopping the hydroelectric project. And one of the consequences was that the Silent Valley was declared as a national park in 1985. This is about the Silent Valley movement. Another movement similar to the Chipko movement is called the Appiko movement. This is in Karnataka. This is 1983, a pivotal environmental initiative in Karnataka's Western Ghats. Who was the person who spearheaded the Appiko movement? Environmentalist Pandurang Hegde. The Appiko movement was led by him, and what was the aim of the movement? To protect the region's forests from deforestation, to protect and to ensure, to promote sustainable forest management. These were the two principal aims of the Appiko movement coming closer home. This is the fourth example I'm placing before you. The fifth example is called Tehri Dam protests. The Tehri Dam, a series of environmental and social movements in the 1970s were launched to oppose the construction of the Tehri Dam on the Bhagirathi River in Uttarakhand. Who was the principal leader of these protests? This was led by Sundarlal Bahuguna, a leading environmentalist. Another point you must remember here is that is that the Tehri Dam protests employed non-violent resistance movements, examples fasts, Padayatra, sit-down, sit-ins, and so on. In the 1980s and 90s, this movement gained momentum and it received widespread support from local communities, from intellectuals, also from activists. Okay, but this was not successful, unlike the earlier example of the Silent Valley project, which was successfully halted and Silent Valley was declared a national park. In the case of the Tehri Dam protests, the dam's construction was actually completed in the year 2006. This is the fifth example I'm placing before you. The sixth example refers to POSCO resistance in Odisha. POSCO resistance, we're talking about protests and movements against the proposed steel plant by the South Korean steel giant called POSCO, POSCO. A huge steel plant was to come up in one particular district of Odisha called the Jagat Singhpur district of Odisha. And with the government of Odisha signing an MOU with this South Korean company, POSCO, a South Korean company called POSCO, POSCO was ready to 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 start excavating for manganese in this particular district. But then the POSCO resistance was quite strong, quite spread over, and after a decade of resistance, the company finally pulled out of the project in 2017. So protests managed to ensure that the South Korean steel company POSCO did not continue mining in the Jagat Singhpur district of Odisha. This is my sixth example. So 6 examples before you. Let me quickly run you through this list again. There are many more environmental movements. To me, I'm looking at each of these environmental movements as expressions of ecological justice. Be it the Chipko movement, be it the Narmada Bachao Andolan, be it the Silent Valley movement or the Appiko movement in Karnataka, Tehri Dam protests or POSCO resistance in Odisha, all of these, according to me, need to be understood as expressions of ecological justice. You may ask me why I've not gone into more details, or you may have more examples to tell me. Please feel free to add to this particular list. But if one is identifying the major or the very important environmental movements in India, I think none of these 6 can be left out. Chipko, Narmada Bachao Andolan, Silent Valley Movement, Appiko Movement, Tehri Dam protests, and POSCO resistance in Odisha. In any list, I think these 6 names would have to figure. Now, as I told you earlier, from these movements, from these struggles, from what all these movements try to do, what are our learnings? What are our lessons? So this section, or this part of this section, looks at learnings and lessons from the above 6 movements. Lesson number 1, or learning number 1, importance of community participation, collaboration, and solidarity. This is the principal lesson from the above movements. Local communities are crucial stakeholders in environmental decision making, and the participation and consent of local communities are essential for sustainable development. This is, to me, a very important learning from the above movements. The importance of community participation, importance of collaboration, importance of solidarity. Learnings and lessons, key learnings and lessons. Among key learnings and lessons, this is the first learning, the first lesson. Secondly, power of non-violent resistance. These movements, all of them, have shown us that non-violent methods can be effective in bringing attention of the government to environmental issues. Why only government? Bringing attention of society also, civil society also, to environmental issues. This can be done effectively, not by using strong arm methods, not by using violent methods, but by using non-violent methods. So this is the power of non-violent resistance, which is learning/lesson number 2, that non-violent methods can be effective in bringing attention of the state, of the government to environmental issues. When one uses the power of non-violent resistance, well, one is also making a statement that these methods build public support and these methods succeed in pressurizing governments to take action, to take necessary action. So this is learning and lesson number 2, power of non-violent resistance. Learning/lessons number 3 brings another term into our discussion, EIA, which expands into environmental impact assessment. This term enters the dictionary of environmental science in India, enters the dictionary of public policy in India also, thanks to all these movements. These movements said, before you take a call, before you decide that some big development project is to happen somewhere in some state of the country, it was these movements that pointed out that EIA, environmental impact assessments, are absolutely necessary. And what was the focus of these EIAs, environmental impact assessments? Was it short term? Was it long term? The answer is EIAs were said to be very important to understand the potential consequences of development projects, meaning both short term as well as long term, but most of the time, it was a look at the long term effects of development on ecosystems, on local communities. So, point number 3, environmental impact assessment is one of the learnings and lessons of all those movements that we looked at. Learning and lesson number 4 talks about sustainable development. And the argument is very simple. All development projects should prioritize sustainability and environmental protection. All development projects. You can't have some projects which prioritize sustainability, other projects which don't. So this learning from those movements pertaining to sustainable development projects should prioritize sustainability, development projects should prioritize environmental protection. In case they are not, if a big development project is not able to prioritize sustainability, is not able to ensure environmental protection, then there is an escape clause which says that alternative solutions that balance human needs with environmental concerns should be explored. Okay, so this is the 4th learning and lesson, sustainable development, which I'd like you to keep in mind. Learning/lesson number 5 brings out the role of activism, brings out the role of advocacy in promoting environmental protection, in ensuring ecological justice. So in point number 5, we are saying activism plays a very important role, advocacy plays a very important role. Both activism and advocacy play a crucial role in raising awareness among the public about environmental issues and ensuring or trying to promote policy changes. Policy changes have to come from the government of the day, trying to get the government of the day to also bring about policy changes in order to promote ecological justice. Okay, environmental movements can inspire policy reform. This was the basic hypothesis, or this was the basic argument of environmentalists. Whatever we believe in, whatever we stand for, that will automatically influence policy. But then some of us know that there's no such thing like automatically influencing policy. Most policy initiatives are those that are being pushed by the government of the day. That's the 5th learning and lesson, role of activism and advocacy. Learning and lesson number 6 importance of alternative perspectives. On the strength of what we already have seen, point number learnings and lesson number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, I think some of you, if not all of you, would have already thought about, well, if these movements are trying to prove a point, and if the arguments are very sound, do we continue with our current model of development? Do we continue with our current perspectives? Or do we come up with alternative models of development? Do we come up with alternative perspectives of development? Indigenous knowledge and local perspectives are valuable in understanding environmental issues and finding solutions. So, alternative perspectives, when looking for alternatives, how far do you have to go? The question says, you don't have to go very far. You look for IKS, indigenous knowledge systems. You look for local perspectives. Alternative perspectives, we are told, can challenge dominant narratives and promote more inclusive decision-making processes. So the sixth learning is the fact that since all these projects and many more projects are doing enormous damage to the environment, are not promoting ecological justice, well, it's time we began thinking about alternative approaches. And where do we get the knowledge from or about alternative perspectives? We don't have to look very far. We get it from indigenous knowledge. We may get it from local perspectives. So this is lesson learning and lesson number 6 that I thought I'll also share with you. Coming to the last of the learnings and lessons titled Need for Policy Reforms. You may want to look at these 2 points I placed before you. One, whatever policies we currently have are not good enough to promote ecological justice or people's development. They're not good enough. And they're existing policies. And therefore, existing policies need to be reformed. Existing policies need to be strengthened to address environmental concerns. And that's another lesson that we learned from those 5 or 6 protest movements that have taken place in different parts of the country. Why do we need policy reforms? Well, the answer is obvious, but let me read this out. Policy reforms for ecological justice can ensure that development projects prioritize environmental protection, prioritize social justice. So policy reform is the need of the hour, is a big point that I'm making here. That is the 7th learning and lesson from protest movements that I have identified. Coming to the 5th part of our framework, legal and constitutional framework of ecological justice and people's development, we don't have to look very far. The Indian Constitution itself, in 2 places, makes a reference to ecological justice and people's development. For example, Article 48A, which states that the state's duty is to protect and promote the environment. Well, you can say, here is one framework, or here is one important article that we need to put into the general framework. Another article, Article 51A, within brackets G, says it's a fundamental duty of all citizens to protect nature. The Article 51G brings in fundamental duties. Then we have the PISA Act, 1996. For those of you who want to know what PISA stands for, the answer is there before you on the screen. PISA stands for Panchayats Extension to Scheduled Areas Act 1996. And this PISA Act actually recognizes self-governance for tribal communities. Again, on paper, it appears that the PISA Act of 1996 does justice to tribal communities and takes care of the livelihood and other concerns. But then studies are also telling us that this is not quite true. Take, for example, the 4th, called the FRA, Forest Rights Act of 2006. Now, again on paper, the FRA 2006 gives legal rights over forest land for traditional forest dwellers. It says if you were traditionally living here, then you're entitled to own some part of the for a forest land. And this was the Forest Rights Act of 2006. The NGT Act of 2010. NGT is frequently in the news, sometimes for right reasons, sometimes for wrong reasons. The NGT is a special tribunal for environmental cases. So you may just like to keep this in mind. We're looking at ecological justice and people's development in India. What does the Constitution have to say about these terms, ecological justice or people's development? And I think these 4 or 5 enactments go a long way in helping us understand that particular reality. When you're looking at constitutional legal, do we leave out judicial activism? Is a good question to ask. And I felt that is important for us also to bring in judicial activism because in many cases the Indian judiciary has been quite innovative, has been quite broad-minded, quite liberal in expanding existing provisions and saying by implication it means something else. A good example of this would be Article 21 itself, and how the Indian judiciary, through its judgment, has expanded the scope of Article 21 to include right to life, right to a healthy environment, and a few cases like the M.C. Mehta case or the Godavarman case on forest conservation are just 2 examples. There are many more examples. 2 examples came to my mind, and I thought I'll just put it here by way of judicial activism. So this takes care of the 5th aspect of our framework, legal and constitutional framework of ecological justice and people's development, where we also have to bring in judicial activism into our framework. In the 6th aspect of my framework, I'm looking at key themes in people's development. From ecological justice, we're now shifting to this term called people's development. And what are the key themes that scholars, that people themselves have been saying are important in this context? I think the very first key theme may be titled resource rights. And let me ask you a question here. Over forests, over water, over land, over minerals, who exercises control? Who owns these common property resources? CPR, as they're called. Forests, water, land, minerals are just a few examples of CPR, common property resources. So who owns them? Who should control them? Who should exploit them? For all these questions, I think the answer is there before us. If these areas don't belong to anybody, if if these if they are termed CPR, common property resources, who exercises control? Well, if they are common property resources, it should be the community which controls all these resources. Now, again, that's on one side of the picture. One side of the picture. We may have laws which say that control over forests, water, land, minerals is to be exercised by the community that lives in that particular area. This argument conflicts with land acquisition laws, conflicts with extractive industries laws, which state governments do formulate, keeping an eye on economic growth, keeping an eye on economic development. We may come back to this, but keep this point in mind that when we're looking at resource rights, we are looking at, well, shall we say a contradiction where one set of laws, one set of arguments point to CPR being owned by the community, but then when the state gives a license to companies to extract minerals, extract resources from these areas without consulting or without getting the approval of the local community, we are talking about a big problem in people's development, resource rights. The second key theme is in terms of livelihoods and biodiversity. The word, if you prefix the word sustainable before livelihoods, or you put it slightly differently, how can livelihoods be made sustainable? Well, one answer would be livelihoods can be made more sustainable through agroecology, through forest produce, through traditional arts and crafts. Well, sustainable livelihoods indeed can be promoted through all these activities. Role of biodiversity in food and health security. This can also provide adequate livelihood, sustainable livelihoods. And when we speak of health security, and when we say especially for women, especially for tribals, well, it's important to preserve biodiversity. So the second key theme is this link between livelihoods and biodiversity. Theme number 3 looks at gender and ecological justice. Because traditionally, women have been custodians of biodiversity, have been custodians of natural resources like water. Traditionally, this has been so in a lot of countries apart from India. And if women are playing such an important role in protecting biodiversity, protecting natural resources, if they are custodians of these resources, are they being given the respect? Are they being treated as are they being treated as true custodians? Well, if the answer is no, if the answer is if the answer is no, then ecofeminism is a term that we need to bring into our understanding and look at feminist ecological movements which are promoting gender justice and ecological justice. This is key theme number 3. Three themes. I won't go into more details. So in my sixth section dealing with key themes, there are just 3 themes which I'm pointing or placing before you. Resource rights, who owns these common property resources, livelihood and biodiversity, is there a connection? And 3, gender and ecological justice. Let's take a brief look at Vandana Shiva's contributions to ecological justice. Well, the first big contribution of Vandana Shiva is that she has been a strong critic of Western science and development. And what is her argument? Vandana Shiva's major argument is that Western science is reductionist, Western science is masculinist, Western science promotes domination over nature. And flowing from this first argument of Vandana Shiva's is this argument that modern development perpetuates ecological destruction. Modern development does not promote gender justice. It does not promote ecological justice. Modern development actually promotes inequality. This is one big argument of Vandana Shiva, or one big contribution of Vandana Shiva, strong critic of Western science and development. The second contribution is in terms of promoting biodiversity, particularly seed biodiversity. She has founded a movement called the Navdanya movement, 1987. And this Navdanya movement promotes seed sovereignty, organic farming, farmers' rights. She has also established a university called the Seed University, Bij Vishwavidyalaya, a unique concept. And in her writing, she frequently criticizes biopiracy, criticizes patents on life, criticizes genetically modified organisms, and she says all of these are forms of ecological colonization. That's a second big contribution of Vandana Shiva. Third big contribution is in terms of ecofeminism. Apart from many others, Vandana Shiva has constantly been saying that women have a unique symbiotic relationship with nature. And when you do ecological degradation. The people who are most badly hit are the women. It disempowers women the most. And her argument that ecological justice is inseparable from gender justice is a powerful statement of ecofeminism, which we credit Vandana Shiva with. Fourth contribution, Vandana Shiva talks about living economies when she calls for earth democracy, where she says that economic systems must respect ecological boundaries, must respect human rights. Vandana Shiva is actually advocating or making a strong case for decentralized, small scale, sustainable, local economies. Her fifth contribution of Vandana Shiva is in terms of critiquing globalization. And how is she doing this? She points out to the World Bank, she points out to the IMF, she points fingers at the World Trade Organization, she points fingers at multinational companies, and just all of them have been consistently imposing top-down development models. And if these models have been globalized, she says globalization is nothing but recolonization. And in this process of recolonization, globalization has been appropriating biodiversity, appropriating traditional knowledge, appropriating livelihoods. And therefore, if you ask Vandana Shiva how she defines globalization, she will just use this 2, 3 words. Globalization is nothing but recolonization. Some of her important works you may be familiar with. If you're not, you must look them up in the library. Staying Alive, Women, Ecology and Development, Earth Democracy, Justice, Sustainability and Peace, Violence of the Green Revolution, Biopiracy, Plunder of Nature Knowledge are 4 key books that I would draw your attention to if you're interested in pursuing or if you're interested in looking very closely at the works of Vandana Shiva. Okay? Under challenges and contradictions, I'm coming to the end of my presentation. As I was telling you earlier, when we look at these terms, ecological justice and people's development, and juxtapose these terms with popular development or mainstream development or dominant development, there are several challenges, several contradictions. I'm placing 4 of them before you. One, the contradiction between economic growth, economic development, and ecological sustainability. Second, challenge or contradiction, dilemmas in balancing rights of local communities with national development goals. Challenge or contradiction number 3, inequities in environmental burden sharing. For example, urban pollution versus rural displacement. And the fourth challenge is in terms of this term called greenwashing, where there's a tokenistic inclusion of sustainability in corporate strategies. These are, I think, 4 big challenges that we need to look at. Your questions, you can probably refer to some of these challenges and contradictions. Tell me what your position is in this particular debate. What is the way forward? I think the way forward is to strengthen environmental governance. There must be transparent, participatory, and accountable decision making. There must be stronger implementation of laws, acts like the FRA, Forest Rights Act, EIA, Environmental Impact Assessment Norms, NGT, National Green Tribunal. You've heard of all these terms. There are laws, there are norms. They must be implemented in true spirit. Number 2, I think we have to recognize that knowledge systems are not uniform. Knowledge systems are not singular. Knowledge systems are plural. And therefore, if there are indigenous knowledge systems, indigenous ecological knowledge, which are rich in diversity, rich in sustainable development, well, we've got to bring that into our public policy. Number 3, we need to promote agroecology. We need to support local economies. How do we do that? By supporting organic farming, by supporting water harvesting, by supporting seed banks, by supporting forest rights cooperatives, Any number of other examples can be added here under point number 3, promotion of agroecology, promotion of local economies. Legal innovations, rights of nature debates. There are judgments of the Supreme Court which say rivers are living entities and we have no right to dam rivers, we have no rights to kill rivers, we have no rights to pollute rivers because rivers are living entities. Nature also has rights. One legal innovation, another legal innovation, environmental justice tribunals, which are looking at most of the issues that we already have raised so far. In terms of way forward number 5, I also bring in inclusive development planning, where people's development must be taken seriously by the government. And when we say people's development, we are saying what kind of development is people's development? We are saying when development is participatory, when development is ecologically sensitive, when development is rights-based, then you have people's development. Finally, this is my last slide by way of conclusion. What am I saying? 3 quick points. Or what have I said so far? 3 quick points. One, ecological justice and people's development are interlinked imperatives in India's pluralistic democracy. You can't leave this out if you believe that India's democracy is pluralistic. Vandana Shiva's arguments provide a radical, grassroots, informed critique of the dominant development model. Not only does it criticize the dominant development model, it also offers viable alternatives which are rooted in biodiversity, gender justice, and earth democracy. And my last point, a truly sustainable future must recognize that justice for nature and justice for people go hand in hand. So I'm through. There are some books that I'd like you to look at. I can share this with you later. Thank you, and I hope you've